All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the September Coffee Break with the Hub. This month we are talking with Jordan Ott, who is the Office of Extramural Support Director. She'll be presenting on Grant Administration 101 with a post-award focus. Before we get started, just a quick mention about next month's coffee break. We are hosting Greg Lawless, who is a specialist within cooperative extension, and he is a really great grant getter here within co-op. We're going to do an interview style sit down with him to talk about how he has become successful in his grant writing and tips he can share with his colleagues so that they can get going on that as well. Here is Jordan. She is the director of the Office of Extramural Support for 3.5 years. Before that, she's been working in sponsored programs for over 20 years as a budget analyst, department manager, center administrator, and director. About UW Extension is the variety of programs Extension is involved in and the huge potential that Extension has to impact the Wisconsin idea through grant work and collaborations. So here's Jordan.
Thank you, Nikki, and good morning, everyone. We have the presentation behind me, and hopefully you'll be able to see the PowerPoint as I go through. And if not, please chat with Nikki, correct? Okay, and let her know, and we'll make some adjustments so you can see that as we go. So, good morning and welcome. We're going to talk about Grant Administration 101. So this is kind of the basics of once you receive an award. We're going to talk through some grant terms, kind of how to speak the language when we're talking about post-award. We'll go through some of the general terms. Then we're going to talk about the team players and the roles and responsibilities in post-award administration and grant administration. And then the rules of the game, excuse me, the regulations, kind of what's the playbook that we have? How are we determining what we need to do and how we do it? And then finally, we'll wrap up with some aid, support, and resources that we have available to everyone here at Extension, and a recap at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with grant terms. So that is an all-encompassing word, meaning sponsored projects, and sponsored projects is any kind of funding coming in from an external source into Extension. And grant is kind of the catch-all word used to identify those funding sources. But it really applies to a grant, which is money coming in with less restrictions. Cooperative agreements are funds coming in, and that's a joint kind of team from the sponsor and our people here at Extension cooperating together to lead a project, and that's called a cooperative agreement. And then we also have contracts, and those are the most restrictive sources of funding that we get. All of those are referred to as grants, external dollars coming in. It really is also referred to as sponsored funding. And then the sponsor is the person, the entity, the organization providing funds to us. Again, it's someone external to Extension. So even within UW system, it's another one of our organizations, sister organizations coming in, we would still consider that an external source. It's not from within Extension. And then grant administration are those things. It's the administration of funds that we have coming in when people give us dollars to do project work. It's also referred to as research administration, most notably when there's research. We do some research here at Extension, but not a lot. And it's also referred to as sponsored programs administration. So any of those terms all mean the same thing. And again, when we use the word grant, it's kind of the catch-all for funds that we have coming in. So grant terms, these are the common terms that you will run into when we're talking post-award or grant administration. Notice of award is the happy time. We've successfully received funding from the sponsor, and you have your notice of award. That notice of award gives us a lot of information that we need, and we'll walk through that in the next couple slides here. Then we also have the period of performance, and that is the time period that the project is to run. So there's a start date and an end date. Those dates are very important to grant administration. There's also the principal investigator or the project director. That's the main person identified by the sponsor who's responsible for making that project happen. In research, that position is usually called a principal investigator. Here at Extension, because we don't do a lot of research, we use the term the project director. But both of those terms, principal investigator, also referred to as a PI, or a project director or program director, a PD, that's the person responsible for making sure that project happens. And we have key personnel. Key personnel are identified as people who are working with the project director who are helping make decisions. It's usually a smaller group. And while we could argue that everyone involved on the project is important and should be key personnel, that's usually referred down to the co-investigators or co-principal investigators. And we identify that group because there's additional information we usually need to submit or follow up with them. So we have to do time and effort reporting for everyone, but with key personnel, there's other things like a biosketch, et cetera, that we submit. So it's important to identify who those people are. Then we have the terms and conditions that come with the award, and that's basically the rules and guidelines that the sponsor is going to function under. They will come with that notice of award. There's also special award conditions, also referred to as SACs. Those are above and beyond the normal terms and conditions. So a special award condition could be that an additional financial report needs to be submitted on a template provided by the sponsor. So those will be sketched out in the notice of award under the terms and conditions and special terms and conditions. We have the approved budget, so that may be different than the budget that was submitted with the proposal application, but that's the budget we're going to go forward with from the sponsor, and that's giving us allowability and total funds that are available for the project. Then if there are any subrecipients involved in the project, we will issue subawards. That's part of grants administration post-award, where we identify those subrecipients and start the process for creating a subaward and getting that issued to them and signed. And then the last two things, the terms that we have here are the technical report and financial report. Both of those are important aspects of grant administration. Those are what we're sending back to the sponsor. Excuse me. Identifying where we are with the project to date. So the technical report is really following the programmatic aspect of the project, what's being done. And then the financial report is obviously sharing financials, expenses, balances, etc. So those are some of the very common grant terms that you will see in working with grant administration. So I thought it would be helpful to actually look at a notice of award just to kind of walk through that. So this is a notice of award that I was working with about 2 weeks ago when I started to pull this presentation together, and I thought it would be nice just to kind of link to it and talk through some of those terms in action on a notice of award. So we routinely in OES pull up the notice of award. We refer to this quite often when we're looking for answers to questions that come up of, can we do this, or how do we do this, or what do we need to do for this? The first place that I'm going to go is to that notice of award, because that's where a lot of the information sits that we need to look at. So this is not the whole page, but this is from the U.S. Department of Commerce. As you can see, it's a cooperative agreement. We get a federal award number. We need to refer to those award numbers routinely. We're working with correspondence with the sponsor. They need to know we are, so that that award ID number helps them. Then we've got the period of performance. We've got the amount of funding that we're receiving, amount of funding that we may be cost sharing, and then the total cost of the project. And then as we scroll down through here, we've got a title. We've got signatures approving that by both the sponsor and ourselves that this funding is going to go forward. And here we have some special award conditions. In this particular project, I think there's about 5 pages of special award conditions. I'm going to scroll through those. Sorry, guys. And then we get to the terms and conditions of the actual project. And I think in this award, there's about, I don't know, I think there's 50 to 60 pages in the full award notice. And so what I'd like to emphasize here is that for the project director and any local administrator working with that project director, it's really important to read through all of that. And as you work with more and more awards, you'll become more familiar with the terms that kind of are common and pop up. So while, 50 pages sounds daunting, it is important that we read through and are familiar with all of those. But as you work with more and more grant awards, these will become familiar and you'll be able to kind of scroll through some of those sections that are pretty common language that are used by the sponsors. So that was just to provide a sample there. All right, moving on. I'm going to transition now to team players and roles and responsibilities involved in grants administration. And I don't know how well you can see this slide, but it's titled Grant Life, and it has an applicant and the funder. And then I have some wording there to the side that says, what's wrong with this picture? Other than the fact that it's way busy and there's a lot of steps going on in terms of the arrows and stuff going on here, one of the things that struck me when I saw this is that you have the applicant by themselves at the computer, and you have this team of funders, kind of planning and communicating. And so to me, what's wrong with this picture is the applicant is not alone. There are so many people here at Extension that are here to help our applicants and our project directors that it really is a team effort. And I want to emphasize that there are many responsibilities involved to get a project applied for and funded and then kicking it happen. So alone, because you don't need to be. We have lots of people here to help. So grant administration is a shared responsibility. The people involved are the sponsor, the project director, any of the project staff, and the administrative staff here at Extension, in addition to administrative staff at the sponsor. So there is a lot of players involved to make this whole grant process happen. And we're all responsible for working together. A concept that I try to display well in the next couple of slides. And I think this is really, really important for everyone to understand. And I think it does get missed. And so I want to make sure that I take some time here and go through this. So when we're talking about grant administration, when we have a funded project, there are two kind of entities involved, and that's the sponsor and Extension. And then within those entities, we have and a program director from the sponsor, in addition to our project director and our administrative staff here at Extension. So these next couple slides are going to kind of play out my point, and that is what I just pointed out. We have sponsor and Extension with similar parallel positions. We have a programmatic leader at the sponsor and a programmatic leader at Extension, and we have an administrative leader at the sponsor and an administrative leader at Extension. What we need are for these groups to communicate with each other. So hopefully the grants officer and the program director at the sponsor are communicating and keeping in touch with what's happening with the project and project funding, just as that same thing needs to be parallel and happening here at Extension. We need administration and programmatic staff to work together to make that grant flow as efficiently and effectively as possible. So what we don't want is every entity kind of operating on their own with no communication. We certainly have that. You know, there's sponsors, some sponsors are very good at communicating, others are not so great. So we don't want this kind of scenario where no one's talking to anyone. It leads to inefficiency and redundant processes to keep and get everybody involved. So this is what we don't want. This is a common scenario that we get, and this is kind of my main point of emphasis. So when you are working with a funded project, the project director and the project officer at the sponsor routinely are in constant communication with each other, whether that's through meetings, whether it's through conference calls. They are working together and making that programmatic aspect of the project work. That's absolutely needed. That's great. But what happens is they tend to kind of go off and plan and do these things and not include administration. And then they hit a hurdle or red tape or administrative burden, and that tends to be a problem.
Can you just explain what you mean by grant officer, who that person might be?
Yep, so a grant officer is the person responsible at the sponsor. So they're the administrative sign-off at the sponsor, similar to my position here at Extension. So they're identified in that notice of award. There's usually all of those contacts are listed. That's one thing I forgot to mention. So you'll have the contacts for each grant laid out in that notice of award, who that contact is. So thank you for that. So in this scenario, like I said, we have the programmatic staff working together, and then they kind of run into this problem because the administrative people haven't been included. So just as the project has processes and steps and timelines, et cetera, the same thing happens on the administrative side. So we need all of that to be working together so we don't run into those problems. So we have, you know, like a project director who's saying, hey, I got approval from my project officer to extend the project period. Well, that project officer really doesn't have the authority to do that. We need that documented, and we need an award notice or a modification or something. We need that documented, and that comes through the administrative side of the project. So that's a common thing that we run into, and I just want to throw out a caution. Make sure that you're keeping all parties involved aware of changes that are needed on the project so we don't run into last minute kind of crazy things that happen. So this is kind of really what we would like to see. All of the parties interacting with each other and keeping each other informed of where that project is going. Okay, so on these next couple slides, what I'm going to talk about are areas, kind of the steps of post-award grant administration, and talk about the roles and responsibilities. And this is internal here at Extension. This is not including the sponsor. This is kind of just what we need to do internally to make sure that we're completing the grant administration the way that it should be. So this looks kind of busy. I'm looking on my screen to make sure that you can see it. It looks kind of busy, but let me explain this, and hopefully this is helpful. So we're going to talk about each kind of aspect of going through grant administration once we have an award. First step is award setup. Then each slide is going to have the roles and responsibilities kind of outlined with that phase of grant administration. And then we've got columns indicating the project director, the department that houses that project director, the division that houses that project, and the staff involved with it, and then OES at the organizational level, and then the provost. So there are some things that involve the provost office. So what I've done is kind of identified who's responsible, who is involved in each of these processes, and then the yellow boxes are indicating who has that primary responsibility. So what you will see as we go through these is a lot of times involved or numerous levels of staff and people here at Extension, but there really is someone who's primarily responsible. So award setup, we receive the notice of award. Kind of one of the first steps that the project director needs to do is if there's any compliance issues, for example, human subjects, make sure that the IRB approval or exception has been received so that that project can move forward. Everyone's responsible for reviewing the approved budget, make sure that it works. You know, a lot of times funders will come back and cut the funding or ask you to do a revised budget. So once that revised approved budget comes back from the sponsor, make sure that we really can complete the project for the amount of dollars that we're receiving. And if not, then we need to have more conversations, but that's really important. And I've highlighted all the areas here because we all have a step in that process. And then finally, once we have all those things in place, we're going to establish a project number, and that's done at OES. So this slide is very busy, but this is really the bulk of what's happening once we have the project in terms of administration. This is not to imply that programmatically there's not a lot going on. This is just in terms of managing the project financials. There are a lot of things happening to make sure that we're spending those sponsor funds correctly. And I think as we go through these, what you'll find is most of the initiation of processes is going to start with the project director and or their local administrative staff, and then move through the division and then up to OES. So prepare financial transactions. I have noted that as the department level. That's whoever is the local administrator working with that PD, the person working kind of hand in hand with our project director. They're going to be responsible for coding invoices, for making purchases, any kind of the financial transactions that need to happen on the project. They will be working with the PD and making sure that those things get coded correctly, processed correctly, in compliance with our university, state, and sponsor statutes. So there's a lot going on there that we have to look at. Rebudgeting requests. So you're going along in your project and realize that you need to do a rebudget. The PD and the local administrator are going to work with that, and that goes through the division and then up into OES for us to look at. Obtain sponsor approval of rebudgeting requests where required. So here I have that that's OES, and again, the department and division are looking at that. So the PD is initiating the rebudgeting request, OES is submitting it. Anytime that we have something that needs to go in writing to the sponsor, that is going to come through my office, through OES, and we'll be the ones communicating with the sponsor. And that's just to make sure that we're in line with the award and with all of the different guidelines that we have to follow. So we're kind of the overseer, making sure that we're in compliance with those things. So that comes through our office. Again, initiating no-cost extensions. We're having some construction noise, so I'm pausing. Initiating no-cost extension. So the project is going along great, but we need some more time because of a delay that happened. We can request a no-cost extension. Some sponsors are not requiring that we request that anymore. So again, you need to work with your local administrator or the division or OES to help determine when that's the case. But those no-cost extensions get submitted through OES. That's usually a cosign on the letter with my name and the PD to the sponsor. Ensure that cost sharing is documented. We're looking to the department level administrators to make sure that cost sharing is identified and is appropriate and is being recorded. Initiate purchases with P-card or procurement as appropriate. I kind of mentioned that with the financial transactions. Again, that's that local administrator working with the PD. Review and approve financial transactions. Again, PD and the local administrator coding those. Use financial reports to monitor and oversee expenditures. Looking at wisdom, using the resources that we have here that will show you the expenses and expenditures, and reviewing and reconciling accounts on a monthly basis. We're looking to the local administrator and the project director to really put their arms around those financial transactions and make sure that they're accurate, make sure that they're timely, and make sure that they're getting processed appropriately. And I really want to emphasize reconciling on a monthly basis, because when things certainly have problems or errors, There's transposition numbers, transposition of numbers on financial account codes, et cetera, that might hit the wrong project. So we need to get those transferred off so that they're put to the proper project. And you can make sure that you catch those in a timely fashion by looking at those expenses on a monthly basis. So it's very important to make sure that you're keeping track of what's happening with the project financially. And then coordinate resolution of issues in the grants module or wisdom. So if you are working with your accounts on a monthly basis and looking at your expenditures and something is not quite right and it has to do with a system issue, let OES know, let your grant accountant know, and we'll certainly get in touch with system and see what we can do to get that fixed. And then audit expenditures, that's what our grant accountants and OES are doing. They'll be kind of overseeing, not on the detailed basis that we need by the PD and the local administrators, but we are approving and authorizing some of the expenditures that come through just to make sure that we are processing stuff that's allowable in this grant. So it's kind of the audit expenditures portion, that's what that means, and we're doing that in OES. So invoicing and financial reporting is something that our grant accountants and OES are doing. So whether that invoicing is monthly or quarterly, we're preparing that invoice to send to the sponsor so that we actually get the funds in. So we have a piece of paper that says we have a notice of award that we're getting so much money. Now we need the rubber to hit the road and get those funds back to extension. And OES, our grant accounts, are responsible for doing that. Accounts receivable management, again, so now we've sent out those invoices, we need to make sure that the funds come back into extension. That is also a responsibility of our grant accountants at OES. So they're receiving and depositing those payments on those invoices or letters of credits or drawdowns that we're doing to make sure that those funds are getting appropriated to the proper project accounts. And monitoring and pursuing collections of delinquent invoices. So we recently received a report from cashiers showing that we had about $60,000 of outstanding invoices that weren't paid. And most of that was coming from federal sponsors. So federal sponsors are kind of hard to collect from, but certainly doable. And in going to a couple of the research administrative conferences over the last couple of years, the universities, the bigger universities, are actually committing staff, like 5 or plus, to make sure that they're getting their dollars back and getting them in, because there have been instances where things aren't coming in. When we looked at ours, we had 60,000 outstanding, and those invoices were from years ago. As I had expected, our staff here certainly had made communications and reached out and consistently tried to get those funds in, and really didn't get anywhere. We just did another push recently. We received some of those dollars in. 60,000 sounds like a lot, it is a lot, but we pull in about 30 plus million a year in sponsored funds. So in the grand scheme of things, over numerous years, 60,000 is a small amount, but know that we certainly are pursuing those dollars, and that is a responsibility of OES. So prior approvals. One caveat I want to mention with this is that with the implementation of uniform guidance, which was the revision of how the rules of the game for federal funds, we have a lot less that we need prior approval for. So the administrative burden on prior approvals has been lessened, and that's good. However, when we do have prior approvals, the initiation of that process is going to come from our project director, along with our local administrator. And then once we are sending that to the sponsor, that's going to come through OES. When it's written, we usually need a cosign on the letter to the sponsor, and that's the PD and myself as director of OES. Subrecipients and subawards. So prior approvals, we lessened the administrative burden. Subrecipients and subawards, the exact opposite has happened. We have a lot of work to do now with subrecipients. Prior to uniform guidance, we did not have the level of oversight and compliance that we have now. It's not a bad thing, it's just a lot of work. And we're okay with that. We have a process here in place and we have forms, et cetera. But when we're working with subrecipients, the subaward request comes to OES, and OES is going to collect some information from each of those subrecipients. We're going to do a risk analysis and a risk assessment to make sure that we can do business with them, that they don't have any issues with any other sponsors, particularly the federal government. And we'll get that subaward issue. So in terms of overseeing the programmatic aspects of a subaward, that's going to fall to the project director. You're working with those subrecipients, you know exactly what they need to be doing. And in turn, when they invoice, we're looking for the project director to sign off on the work that they're saying that they completed. So that's kind of how we're making sure that what we're paying them for is truly what they're doing. So it's really important to have our project directors involved in the financial aspects and the grant administration of any of the subrecipients. Subrecipient monitoring, that is going to be all levels. That's going to be the project director, the local department administrators, the divisional administrators, and OES. So as we work with subrecipients and we have issues that come up, we'll be in touch with everyone, and everyone should be in touch with us if there's any problems. So let me just prepare, negotiate, and execute subawards. We look to the divisions to work with the local department administrators to kind of get that subaward drafted, and then comes to OES and we'll send out to the subrecipients. Okay, so technical data and project reporting. This is the aspect of the project which is all the programmatic, the real work. What is the project doing? And the project director is responsible for all of this. So ensuring integrity of the research data or the actual project output, that's the PD. Preparing and submitting technical reports to the sponsor is the PD. And maintaining the official copy of the technical report also is going to sit with the PD. Personnel and effort reporting. Because we are recipients of federal funds, we have to ensure that we are tracking and recording and reporting where our salaries are charged to grant projects. And here at Extension and with UW System, well, it's just with UW-Madison and Milwaukee, we have eCert. So in terms of personnel and effort reporting, if we're going to be hiring any new staff for a project, the PD and local administrators are responsible for that. Completing necessary adjustments to award charges and/or payroll distribution. That's going to be the local departments and their divisional office to make sure that those are allocated correctly to the grants. Obtaining necessary supervisory reviews and approvals. We're going to look to those local department administrators for that. Ensuring accuracy of completed effort certification. We're looking to the project directors for that. So the programmatic staff that are being charged to the project, we need the PD to look at those effort certifications and ensure that what's being charged and allocated is correct. And then resolve problems or follow up on certifications not submitted. We're looking to our effort coordinators and the department and/or division to help with that. So project end and closeout. We've done everything that we need to do. We're now ready to close out the project. Early closeout situations is the responsibility of the PD. I don't think I've ever seen that. There's always more that can be done, and if there's funds left, usually we're working with a sponsor to make sure that that's allowable to do whatever we want to do. But if there's an early closeout situation, we're going to look to the PD to identify that. So in terms of all the expenditures that need to be posted to the accounts, when the grant accountants are getting ready to do the final financial report, they're going to look to the local administrators and division to make sure that everything's been processed. So you'll usually get a communication from them saying, hey, we've got a final report due, and want to make sure that you've got everything processed, that there's no outstanding charges or pending things that are still out there unpaid. that need to be processed so we can allocate that to the project. So that's in conjunction with the division, the local administrator, and OES. We're going to look to that group to make sure that we've got everything captured on the project expenditures. And then in terms of preparing that final invoice and report and submitting it, that's our grant accountants and OES who are responsible for that. Resolve issues related to unreconciled accounts, that's going to fall to our department, division, and OES. We're routinely working together to get those things cleaned up. Ensure that all financial reports have been submitted to the sponsor. That is the responsibility of my office, of our grant accountants and OES. Monitor submission of final technical reports to sponsor. That's going to be our project director. And some sponsors will ask for those things to be submitted together, both a financial and a technical report. That's fine. We'll do those in collaboration and make sure they get submitted together. But if not, the PD is responsible for getting the technical report in. Then these next two things, the final invention reports and the patent pending, or patent reports to sponsor. Oh yes, our grant accountants usually do that. We don't routinely have a lot of that to report, but if we do, we're certainly going to be in touch with our project director. And then inactivate the award account in the financial accounting system. That's OES's responsibility. And just a heads up, we usually keep the account open for a year because there are a lot of residual things that happen. So we have a control date behind the scenes that doesn't allow expenditures to hit, but you will see that account open for a year after its final project period. And that's because there's weird things that come through, whether it's fringe benefit adjustments, et cetera, that are coming through for system or other things. And rather than routinely get this list of hundreds of accounts to go back in and open up, we just leave those accounts open for a year. So we can easily make the changes, but know that you can't process expenditures to that. There's kind of two things that are controlling what goes through that account. But if you see it in the system a year after the fact, that's why. And then maintain the official project closeout documents for sponsored projects. OES is responsible for those closeout documents. And finally, audits. I think probably the word that you hear the most from any staff in OES is audits, and that's because our job is to oversee compliance with the sponsor guidelines that we have. And what will happen when we have an audit is they're going to look for documentation. So we are constantly looking for written approvals or documentation to back up what we're doing on projects. So you're going to hear the word audit from us because that's kind of the rules that we have to live by. So there's two aspects of audits. And this first thing noted here, the A133 audit is mandatory. And we have that done through the state. And so that's done automatically, and it's also something that we look for any of our subrecipients. We're going to look for their audit reports, their A133 or single audit. And then if we are audited, so say a sponsor wants to come in and audit one of our projects, everyone who's involved in that project, all levels, the project director, the department, the division, and OES will be involved, but OES will be the primary contact for the auditors and will work through us and ask for documents, et cetera, as we go forward with an audit. So these happen. They're usually pretty intense and require a lot of effort and time and documents, but they're worth it in the end if we can do it right and continue to get sponsored funding. And then ongoing training, I didn't say that anyone was primarily responsible because it really depends on what kind of training we're talking about. But everyone is responsible for that. If you have new staff and you'd like them to get some training and you're not quite sure who should be providing that, feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to answer that question. As I said, it really depends on what we're talking about and what aspect of training. But in the end, we're all responsible for training our new staff here at Extension. Okay, so rules of the game, the regulations. Kind of refer to this as we were talking about grant administration. But there's several levels of guidelines and rules that we're following when we're working with grants. And the first and foremost is the federal government. They have the Code of Federal Regulations, and uniform guidance follows under that. It's referred to as 2 CFR 200. We just follow uniform guidance. If we have contracts, there's also the federal acquisition regulations, the FAR clauses. So those are kind of the federal level of rules that we have. And then any of the agencies will also have additional terms and conditions or guidelines, special award conditions. We need to look at those. So from the federal level, there's just several sources that we need to look at. And we also have our state regulations. They impact procurements, they impact travel. And then we also have our university regulations. So when we're looking at whether or not something's allowable in the grant, there's a lot of places we're looking to make sure that we're in compliance, and it does take time. Again, as you get more familiar with this, with these terms, et cetera, it makes it easier, but in the beginning, we're looking at a lot of stuff to make sure that we're doing what we are supposed to do and doing it correctly. So the federal rules usually take precedence in terms of how we're doing grant administration, and that is because one of the federal rules is that we have to treat all grants consistently. So it's easier just to take the federal rules and apply those across the board, whether or not we have federal or non-federal funding. And most universities and recipients of sponsored projects do this. So I know the federal rules rule, and most of our universities and most of the people we collaborate with are following those same rules, which makes it nice because it's less to learn once you have all of those kind of in your head, you're good to go. And then this just reiterates what I already said. When addressing allowability or what we can and can't do with the project, we're looking at all sources of rules and guidelines to make sure that we're in compliance. And there are many times when those different sources conflict. And that's where we end up trying to figure out what's the best route. Routinely, we will get in touch with sponsors and ask questions. We'll look for documentation so that if audited, we can say we came to this conclusion and here's what we did. Here's who we contacted. And here, consistency is key. It really is. Okay, so why play by the rules? You know, one of the things you notice these days is that rules are good and okay to follow, but it doesn't matter unless you get caught, right? Well, why play by the rules? Well, it's the integrity of the work that we do here. If we are audited and if we're not playing by the rules, there's some big consequences with that. We want our organizational reputation as a recipient of federal funds to be in good standing, and we want to put out a quality product. So that's why we're going to follow the rules. And then the risk if we don't, audit findings, loss of future funding, depending on what rule was broken, it could even be a performance issue and loss of your job, and government shutdown. So there have been instances where sponsors have shut down all projects related to a university, et cetera, because of issues with how the funds are being used. So we want to follow the rules, and we're certainly here to help make sure that we can. So aid, support, and resources. The first place I would point you to is our SharePoint site for OES. There's a lot of information there and a lot of links. So that is our link to SharePoint. If you don't know how to get to it, it's not easy, but it is doable. But again, that really houses a lot of the information that you would need. And then all of our administrative staff here at Extension, whether it's our local administration, our divisional administration, or OES at the organizational level, we're here to help. And please ask questions, and we'll get those things addressed. So just ask. Is all that I have. So thank you for listening, and we're going to pause and wait for some questions because I think there's a little bit of a drag on the presentation. So we'll wait here a minute.
We do have 2 questions in the queue. Do only key personnel need to go through IRB, or does everybody that works on the grant? For example, if I'm working with somebody from Collaborative Extension Technology Services to develop a module, if they're not receiving any money from the grant, do they need to do IRB?
Okay, so I think that question is around whether or not they have to apply for IRB approval, or whether or not they have to do human subjects training. Everyone on the project should have completed human subjects training if we have human subjects involved in a project. So that's a pretty common practice. I know here at Extension, we're looking for the PD certainly to have compliance. But rule of thumb, yes, key personnel should have completed the human subjects training. And if a project is working with human subjects, that project should have the IRB approval.
If a sponsor doesn't require a no-cost extension request, what happens then? Can you extend the project indefinitely until the budget runs out?
So the question was, if no cost extension prior approval isn't required, what do you do, and can you just keep on going forever as long as you have funding? So the first part of the answer to that is please work with OES and let us know if you plan on doing that, because within our systems, we need to extend that project period and make sure that the project period is responsive to the new end date. Could it go on indefinitely? I guess technically it could. We really would want to kind of set some real dates. One of the things that we and OES are going to be looking for, if you're doing a no-cost extension, we're going to look at what your projected balance is and talk to you about what the work scope left to do is, and we probably ask you to budget that out so that we have a sense of what are you doing, and is it within the guidance of or guidelines of the project. So the answer is, could it go on forever? Yeah, it probably isn't likely though. And we're going to ask for a projected end date based on your resources, based on other projects, what's realistic in terms of what we could tell the sponsor when we're going to finish this project.
All right, that is all our questions.
Okay.
So I want to thank Jordan again for our presentation. This will be posted to the Funding Resource Hub's website after I do some editing to cut out some blank space at the very beginning. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you again next month, October 5th, I believe is the date. All right, thank you.